as an economic activity. Now, economic activities are the engines of growth in every country. All countries have a diverse range of economic activities, but some activities are actually more common in some countries than in other countries. And much of this is dependent on things like the resource endowment. What is the resource endowment about? It is the type of natural resources that a country might have. It might also be related to things like the human capital or the human resources of a country, like how educated the population is. And depending on how educated the population is and the type of skill sets that are in a particular population, a country may have a greater level of focus on a particular industry. As it relates to natural resources, if we can think about one of the largest industries in our country, the tourism industry, that contributes very, very significantly to our economy. And that is an industry that encompasses several different things. When we think about the tourism industry, you can think about who is involved in the tourism industry. You know that farmers are involved in the tourism industry. Farmers supply a lot of these hotels with food, right? And they operate on one side. Another sector that might be connected to the tourism industry also involves things like the provision of the manufacturing of furniture, and so people who manufacture goods might supply the tourism industry. The tourism industry also, it primarily involves the provision of services to individuals. And so when we think about industries, I also want us to think about how these industries are connected to each other, right? So don't think about an industry or an economic activity as being, standalone. Oftentimes, economic activities link to each other. And at the end, or throughout this list, we're going to focus on some of those linkages. I want you to think about some of the economic activities that take place in your community. Now, in my community, many economic activities might not be very visible. If you think about it, I live in a residential community, but within that residential space, economic activities are still taking place. People walk past my gate selling items. There may be shops in my community. Maybe there are people providing particular services in my community. Maybe there's a hairdresser, somebody offering an extra lessons class in that community. If you're from an area where, maybe perhaps a rural farming community or something like that, you may have a lot of agricultural activities taking place right in your neighborhood. And so this section of the syllabus is actually a very, very relatable section, right? It is relatable because you live the experience, you live with these experiences on a day-to-day basis. On a day-to-day basis, some of you engage in various economic activities, right? Now, because economic activities are so diverse, it makes sense for us to come up with some classifications, so a way of simplifying or grouping economic activities. And one of the traditional or the earlier ways of classifying economic activities was to use these three categories: primary, secondary, and tertiary economic activities. Now, a primary economic activity, so we have used those, so that was a traditional way of looking at it. But more recently, and I would say probably in the 80s coming down, we saw certain industries, we saw the emergence of new classifications or additional classifications like the quaternary industry and the quinary industry. Now, we're not going to be focusing on those industries because it goes beyond the domains of the CSEC syllabus. However, we're going to be going into a bit of detail of as it relates to the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary industry. So we're going to be learning about what each of these industries involves, what are the characteristics of these industries, and of course, linking these industries back to things like location and that type of thing. So when we think about primary industries, and anytime you hear the word primary, you think about something at its most basic level, right? So you went to primary school and it's a kind of first level of education, right? So the primary industry, this concept is similar. So if you're asked to define this in an exam or something like that, you just think about it primary as the most basic industry. It's that first industry, and it is that industry that from which we take natural resources directly from the earth. As such, we call this industry the extractive industry. And some of those examples might be things like farming, fishing, or mining activities. And why we call them extractive industries? Because we're literally extracting material in many cases from the natural resources of the earth, right? So if a fisherman goes out there on his boat, and many of you probably have been to Port Royal or several other fishing villages, fishing communities in Jamaica, we have a lot of communities depend on fishing as their main source of revenue. And so fishers will go out there and they'll catch fish and they'll carry it and they'll sell it. Farmers, farming, very important in Jamaica, in many regards, and we're going to get into some of those in a second. Mining, when we think about things like the bauxite mining and the mining of oil and all of these things, all of these processes involve some form of reliance on the natural resources, and of course, we directly take or extract from these natural resources. When we think about things like forestry, the lumber that is used to make your furniture, that is also considered to be an extractive industry. We go into the forest, we chop down trees. And of course, another section of the syllabus will deal with some of the implications of that. But that certainly is considered to be an extractive industry as well. Now, so I want you to look at these different examples, and these are all examples taken from Jamaica. I really didn't have to show these pictures because I'm sure that everybody has seen something similar to this as you move around the country on a day-to-day basis or at some point in your lifetime. So in the top left-hand corner, that's a farmer, and he's in his field and he's growing crops and stuff like that. And he's directly dependent on the natural resources of the land, the soil and all of these things, the climate and all of this. He's directly dependent on the natural resources. We have a fisherman on the other side who is, taking up a fish pot, and that too is considered to be an extractive industry because you're taking material directly from in this case, the ocean, right? And so fishing, as I said before, fishing, some communities are primarily farming communities. You have other communities that are primarily fishing communities, and so. Now, if you go down to the bottom of your screen, you will see another type of extractive industry, and this involves a more intensive process of extraction, right? These industries on the left-hand side is it's a limestone quarry, right? So that's the extraction, the mining of limestone, and some of that material is actually taken and exported to the US and other places, and used as raw materials in the production of things like cement and other things, right? Bauxite is very common, and we have a lot of bauxite deposits in Jamaica. In fact, our bauxite mining has actually declined quite a bit over the years for various reasons. Some of those reasons are linked to competition and other factors that we will touch on in another section of the syllabus. But bauxite is one of those industries that has been one of the mainstays of our economy for several years. So on that picture on the left, on the right-hand side of the screen, bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you will see bauxite being extracted via open cast mining. Now, how important are these are these industries? Primary industries are extremely important. They represent the base, but they also represent the backbone of many other industries because nearly all commodities start at a primary level. So, if you think about it, primary industries provide the raw materials for other industries. If you think about something like food processing, for example, a lot of the components of food processing, a lot of the food that is processed is taken from a farmer. A large company, a large food processing enterprise like Grace Kennedy, for example, they have contracts with farmers and they get supplies from farmers, things like pork and other things. And when they get these supplies, they process them. They add, it goes through all sorts of different processes. They add preservatives, they can it, they do all sorts of packaging and so. But essentially what Grace does is that they create value added to these products. They add value. So crops are sold locally and also exported. And that is another advantage. That's another reason why the primary industry is so important. So some of these crops that farmers grow are sold in local markets. They're sold they're distributed to supermarkets. They're distributed to large distribution companies. But a lot of it is also exported. Agriculture contributed about 7% to our GDP in 2018. Now, across the Caribbean region, the contributions of agriculture to the GDP varies. And at this point, I know you've probably not heard the term GDP before. Now, GDP means gross domestic product. And that simply means the value of the goods and services produced in a country. The total value of all the goods and services produced in a country. So what we see across the region is that the value that we get from certain commodities is more depending on where you are. So in some areas, tourism like Antigua and many of the islands of the Eastern Caribbean, tourism contributes most significantly to their GDP. In other places, you might have other sectors contributing to the GDP. In this case, since we're focusing on the primary industry, 7%, as I had mentioned earlier, 7% of the GDP in Jamaica in 2018 was contributed by agriculture, right? That is our largest that is our largest primary industry, the primary industry that makes the most contribution. Now, in many Caribbean islands, and in places like Trinidad, of course, and other areas across the Caribbean, that the contributions of agriculture have declined, but they have also declined in places like Jamaica over the years because the agricultural sector has been challenged. Now, another important contribution of the primary industry is that it involves the employment of people. So guess what? The primary industry for people that are fishers and farmers and any other career that you can think about, people that work in driving the tractors and operating the equipment on a bauxite, on one of the bauxite pits. These people are part of our labor force. And so, if you think about it, the primary industries provide employment. In fact, in Jamaica, it contributes about 16% of our about 16% of our total employed labor force is engaged in primary economic activities. Much of this is agriculture. Now, another very important benefit of the primary industries looks at our food. When you think about the food that we eat on a day-to-day basis, the food that makes its way to our plate, the ground provisions, the vegetables, all of these things, these unprocessed foods are sourced locally. Many of them are sourced locally. Of course, we import quite a bit, right? But many of them are sourced locally, and these are an important component of our diets. So the primary industry, particularly agriculture, of course, also contributes to things like our food security. That's a big word. That term really looks at the extent to which your population has access to adequate, clean, safe, and healthy food for consumption. And of course, when we grow our own food, that can potentially enhance our food security. So, I want you to look at this map for a second. And this map shows the production of pumpkin in Jamaica by community. So it shows different communities in Jamaica that produce pumpkin, and you can look at it and you can see the extent to which the production of pumpkin varies. Geographers like to use this big term that you might see at some point in reading the textbook called spatial variation. Spatial. And what does that mean? It just means across space, essentially. How does it vary from place to place, right? And if you look at it, you can see some patterns are quite evident. For instance, if you look, most of the pumpkin that is grown in Jamaica is grown in the parish of St. Elizabeth, right? Now, the tons are reported on your legend, and in most of those communities, the output is between 1,164 and 2,947 tons. So those are the communities in St. Elizabeth, particularly the southwestern sections of St. Elizabeth, south and western sections of St. Elizabeth. Now, overall, Jamaica produces on an annual basis about 53,000 tons of pumpkin. Yams, even more, about 70,000 tons of yams on an annual basis. And these things contribute significantly to the revenue that we get. So because some of our produce is exported. They also contribute a lot to just the circulation and the movement of money around the country and to the livelihoods of people. Remember that farmers sell the pumpkin. Farmers sell the yam. You have a man who is operating, who is assisting the farmers, and all of these things contribute to the economy of an area. And the economy is in many communities, the economy is really driven by these primary agricultural activities. Now, primary activities don't operate in isolation. As I mentioned earlier, they provide the raw materials for other industries. So, These industries are described as secondary industries. And secondary industries are those industries that are involved in the production of processed goods. We also term them the manufacturing industry. They rely on materials from the primary industry or from other materials in the service, in the secondary, in other areas of the secondary industry. And of course, they're also reliant on services and other things that might come out of the tertiary industry. So in this way, the secondary industry really is an industry that's located at a kind of middle point or intermediate point, in a simple sense, in a very oversimplified sense, it is the bridge between the primary and the tertiary industry. The secondary industry is that bridge. What are some of the examples of secondary industries in the Caribbean? We have garment industries that really deal a lot with textiles and clothing and that type of thing. Also, manufacturing. Not manufacturing, food processing, I should say. Food processing, refining of oil. All of these things. If we look outside the Caribbean, the production of automobiles and equipment and the production of chemicals, which also happens a lot in the Caribbean, production of chemicals. All of these things, anything to do with manufacturing, is related to the secondary industry. Now, one of the things you might not think about as being as a secondary industry activity, because oftentimes when we think about secondary industry, we often have these elaborate ideas or elaborate images of people working in a factory and machines and heavy equipment, but a lot of the secondary industry is in fact light industry, and much of it takes place sometimes in people's homes. So if you or in very, very small spaces. Sometimes the secondary industry is not necessarily very mechanized. And as in the case of the example that you're seeing on your screen on the left, which is it shows a guy doing basket weaving. Now, the materials that he would have used for that basket weaving would have been extracted from the primary industry. And guess what? It is good. His products, the commodities that he makes, these commodities will be distributed in the tertiary. But let's hold off on that one for a second. On the right-hand side of the screen, you're seeing some women sorting some ackee and so you would have, so the ackee would be the primary, it would be extracted from the primary industry, and then now it is now a part of the food processing process. Now, when they can these ackees or do whatever type of packaging they want to do with it, whenever they package these commodities, now value is actually added. And what do I mean by value being added here? What they would have bought the ackees for, if an ackee is valued at X, right? X per dozen. By the time it goes through the second phase of processing, it is going to be valued at X plus something, right? It's going to be valued more because of all the other raw materials that have been added to it. And also because of the labor inputs and all other inputs that come into it at this stage. Secondary industries are extremely important. They provide commodities for distribution on the local or international market. So, of course, a lot of the things that we produce, we can sell them, they're sold locally or they're exported. For example, Trinidad is the largest exporter of manufactured goods in the Caribbean. Now, secondary industries are also very important as it relates to the revenue that they generate from many Caribbean countries. Approximately 8.5% of Jamaica's GDP is from the manufacturing industry. Now, of course, this varies. Many Caribbean countries don't have very developed manufacturing sectors, right? They are very different from countries in the Far East, China and Malaysia and some of those other countries that we call the Asian tigers. They're very different from those countries. And that is for various reasons. One of those reasons being, just the cost of energy. And the cost of energy tends to be higher in islands. It tends to be higher in places that you don't actually have that have to import fuel, right? But when we talk about islands, one of those islands that does not have a high energy cost is Trinidad. And because of that is because Trinidad actually has oil. And they use a lot of this oil. That oil mining would be part of their primary industry. And the refining of oil now, the oil extraction is primary, the refining of it would come under the secondary industry. But that energy is actually used to drive production in this country. And so you saw that figure of Jamaica's production, of Jamaica's manufacturing sector contributing about 8.5% to GDP. Guess what? In Trinidad, it is much more. It's more than twice Jamaica. It's about 16% of their GDP. They get about 16% of their GDP from the Caribbean and from manufacturing. And of course, as I had mentioned, a lot of their manufactured goods are actually exported. They provide materials for the tertiary sector. So a lot of the stuff that you see in the tertiary sector is made in the secondary sector. They also provide a lot of materials for other components of the secondary sector and the primary sector, right? The fertilizers that are used in agriculture, right, the process of producing that fertilizer, right? The factories that produce that fertilizer, they would be considered as part of the secondary industry. So all of these industries are very intricately linked. And ultimately, one of the benefits is the fact that the cost of living in a country might actually be reduced with a developed secondary industry. Now, that's not always the case, but certainly in some territories that are actually producing a lot, it can keep the cost of certain commodities down for the population. But it's not as simple as that, but for at this level, we can consider it as being just that. So we're going to go on to the final industry, and this is the tertiary industry. Now, these industries specialize in the provision of services. What are some of these services? And I want you to think about what services you would have to interface with on a daily basis. When you go to the supermarket and you buy a product in the supermarket, or you pay a taxi man who is transporting you, or you purchase something, anything, or you get a particular service. You might be going to an extra lesson service. You might be going to see a doctor. All of these, the provision of services, represent the tertiary industry. They are part of the tertiary industry. Now, this industry does not normally involve the production of goods, but it's more focused on the transfer and distribution of goods and the transfer and delivery of services, right? Now, perhaps the best example of a service industry in Jamaica and the Caribbean is that service industry that we like to consider it, it's because it's the main expression of our tourism, the sea, sun, and sand industry, our tourism industry. I'm just saying sea, sun, and sand, only because, that is the most common expression of tourism in the region. Of course, there are other types of tourism, like heritage tourism as well, and that too is a part of our service industry. And many other types of tourism that don't necessarily rely on the sea, sun, and sand. Now, so I have an industry here, the tourism industry. You see a shipping harbor, you see some what appears to be some tourists. Also have on the right-hand side of your screen juicy patties. And so some of you might be saying, but how is juicy a part of the tertiary sector? And it is really a part of the tertiary, it's really considered to be a part of the tertiary sector because it involves the distribution of food that is processed at the secondary level. So it involves the distribution or retail of food. So retail activities are an important component or an important part of the tertiary sector. Now, the tertiary sector is very important. Of course, they contribute a lot to the foreign exchange earnings and to our GDP. And remember what I said GDP was? It is the total value of goods and services produced in a country, our gross domestic product. So, tourism, so the tertiary economic activity contributes quite a bit. And this is particularly the case if you have a lot of your economy dedicated to these activities. In 2018, the tourism industry contributed about 34% of Jamaica's gross domestic product. The tertiary sector creates employment opportunities for many Jamaicans. In fact, about 70% of the employed workforce is involved in the service industry, and much of that is in tourism. Now, this sector also provides greater access to us, as it relates to the provision of goods and services. So if you're thinking about it, all of these fast food chains that you'll be seeing across the place, all these supermarkets, all these, the provision of doctors, medical services, anything you can think of, all of these, if we have a developed tertiary industry, then there is greater access to many of these services. So one of the benefits of the service industry is that it provides, in both direct and indirect ways, greater access to goods and services in our country. Now, the final thing is that the government actually derives a lot of tax revenue from tertiary industrial activity. Now, and of course, this is again connected to the extent to which the extent to which the sections of an economy might be dedicated to these activities. So, in many countries, what we have seen in the Caribbean in recent times is that, over the last few decades, is that we have really transitioned from agriculture towards an industry towards an economy that is more service-based or service-oriented. And of course, a lot of tax revenue can be derived from that. Now, we're going to get into some trivia questions. I hope that you guys would have understood the concepts that we have discussed so far. Now, many of these questions appear in the multiple choice as well as in some of in the long answer paper, which is paper 2. I'm going to just go into some of the multiple choice questions, and I want you to just I want you to think about the answer for a second. First question, which of the following economic activities may be classified as primary? Is it A, car manufacturing, B, tourism, C, oil mining, or D, food processing? So if you guessed oil mining, you would be correct. That's the only one there that represents an extractive industry. It is the only example thereof, it's the best example thereof, the only example there of primary economic activity. Which of the following is the most important consideration in the location of primary industries? Now, this is something that I actually should have mentioned a little bit earlier, but you might have picked it up from our discussion. Because primary industries are so reliant on natural resources, they're so dependent on natural resources, and of course that's why we call these extractive industries, and they're extracting directly and in various ways from these natural resources. It often means that many primary industries need to locate close to these resources, or at the resources need to be at the location of that activity. So to answer the question, which of the following is the most important consideration in the location of primary industries? Would it be power, labor, transportation, raw materials? And it would be the raw materials. Okay, so that's it for today, folks. That's it for the lesson. If you have any questions, send them to Television Jamaica's Facebook page at Television Jamaica, or to Instagram at television_Jamaica, or simply use the hashtag TVJClassTime, and I'll answer as many questions as I can. For me, it's bye for now. Cape Economics is after the break. Thank you.